Everybody. Welcome to our 197th Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. We are hosted by the University of Reading and we are sponsored generously by the Sports Economics Review. Today we have Mario Lackner presenting work with Hendrik Sonnebend from Dugout to Departure, Sleep Loss Leads to Mental Errors, Evidence from a Natural Experiment. Excuse me, before I let Mario go, I just want to say that there are slots available for the next couple of months. And so if you would like to present work, or you know someone, a colleague or a PhD student who would like to present work, please do get in touch. There's some empty slots in the next few weeks. They're listed on the reminder that was sent out earlier on. So do have a look at that. And if you want to present, do get in touch with me. I'll be delighted to have you presenting in the series. Mario, you're a regular, so you know the format, so please do take away your presentation.
Yeah, by now I should know the format pretty well, I guess. So thank you for giving me this slot, though I was kind of late in deciding on this. I hope everything works out technically, otherwise just interrupt me. So this is quite recent work, as I already mentioned a couple of seconds ago, and it is joint work with Hendrik, who is also in the audience today. Just came back from London presenting this, and yeah, we kind of wanted to remember David Allen a bit with this, whom we talked a lot about issues related to this research question today, and who received very sad news from when we started this project. So this was kind of a topic we started at the beginning of the year, and at the beginning we had lots of different ideas how to tackle this, and here are just some stylized facts here motivating this kind of project, where it doesn't take long to kind of find immediately striking numbers that show you that everyday business travels, at least in the US, but probably globally, play a huge role, not only in the tourism industry in general, in the hotel industry, but also they are a large part of whatever is going on in companies, where typically top-level managers, CEOs, whatever, travel all across the States, travel all across Europe, all across the world, basically, and generate huge revenues in hotels, in airlines, and whatnot, in order to have their short business meetings, make probably very important decisions. And when you look at the numbers after basically 2021, you see that the huge downdrop that you saw during the pandemic is already probably made up for, and we are coming back to numbers already going beyond what we saw pre-pandemic. So when you read articles about this phenomenon, that business people travel quite frequently and make all these important decisions when they are probably jet-lagged, then some articles even explicitly mention that these CEOs are basically athletes, and they should look at their business lives as being athletes, where they travel from one to another destination. They have important meetings there. They have to perform, they have to make their important decisions and take out as much as possible from that. So that's when we came into play here, and we thought about how can we actually go about this, and where do we find a sport that actually resembles what we see in this overnight traveling or day-by-day traveling, that resembles here what is going on in the business world. So we thought about the question, the research question that we had in mind: does high frequently traveling and the associated loss of sleep actually affect mental errors? So should we expect that these business people are actually making worse decisions than had they stayed at home, or had they had some like virtual meetings, whatever? And we ultimately decided on looking at the MLB, Major League Baseball, and we got data from 42 seasons actually, covering thousands of games that have a unique feature, which is that lots of these games are actually played on subsequent days, with traveling basically happening overnight. So we have a natural experiment at work, probably diluted by some factors that we need to take into account. But in the end, there are many, many factors that are at work potentially. So we could see negative effects coming from travel fatigue. And the surprising thing is, when you look up the literature on travel fatigue related to economics, most of the evidence is actually coming from sports anyway. There could be positive effects traveling westwards between time zones, because you actually gain time and you have additional hours. In the MLB, potentially 3 potential additional hours that you gain from traveling from east to west. And there could be a negative effect from traveling basically eastwards, where you lose time. So our main contribution lies in the fact that we want to estimate the causal effect of sleep loss on mental performance. We think we can find or provide an almost ideal or the best possible way to measure mental mistakes here in this context of people or individuals that are traveling frequently. And we can identify these mental mistakes on the individual level, which helps us a lot in finding these heterogeneous effects after all. We want to provide convincing evidence that we can separate travel fatigue from sleep loss. We will actually present evidence that there is no travel fatigue at all, at least not in the sample of games that we look at, but there is a considerable effect coming from loss of sleep. And we try to find some effect heterogeneity, and our most important results, at least that's what we think at the moment, is that age plays a huge role, and we can probably be the first evidence providing clean evidence disentangling age and experience effects as potential channels. So just a quick look at the literature, and it's only going to be a very quick glance at the economic, really the core economic literature, because obviously sleep loss and the effects on all sorts of outcomes is important for medics, for psychologists, pretty much probably for many, many disciplines that are associated with any sort of outcomes in terms of health, performance, whatever you have, mental health, everything is out there. So there are some quite well published papers out there that look at the negative effects of sleep on productivity or labor market outcomes. And the effect is these authors find are typically very large. So they are surprisingly large, especially the effects that they find on short and medium-term employment. So it's kind of interesting to see that using this mostly time use data and using exogenous variation coming from all sorts of discontinuity, like time zone borders or stuff like that, you can identify quite substantial effects on labor market outcome. Also, time zones in general and variations in daylight, whether it's north-south, whether it's just across some discontinuities, whether you have switches from daylight saving time to normal time, has undesired outcomes. So all sorts of different outcomes, health-related, some in the Journal of Health Economics, some general effects, some mental health issues. So there are effects all across the board. Also, there is clear evidence that sleep, or rather lack of sleep, can affect cognitive performance. So there are some studies looking at test scores where there is some exogenous variation. And whenever you lose some sort of part of your standard sleeping routine, this does affect your later performance, also your mental performance. There are some interesting results when it comes to traveling. Some papers do actually argue that there is a positive effect of traveling, which I find very, very surprising and almost too too unexpected to be fully true in every context. And some contributions explicitly find a negative effect coming from traveling eastwards, which I would argue in the end is probably the cleanest evidence to present in order to find something where you lose sleep because you lose automatically at least 1 hour that you can spend on sleep, but more on that in a minute. Sleep loss affects decision making. Sleep loss does also affect how groups coordinate. So when groups are jet-lagged, when they work together all across the world, then this obviously impairs their productivity. There is some evidence on sleep loss or the changing from daylight saving time to normal time actually affecting driving accidents. But other papers do argue that these effects mostly come from different angles that the sunlight will hit you. So there is no conclusive evidence there. It does affect financial decision making. So we will focus on that a little bit more when we talk about the age story here. And a very close paper is the paper by Song et al., who also look at MLB data. They use all sorts of outcomes related to box scores in Major League Baseball. But what they find is, first of all, completely different to what we find. They use a very, very basic approach in their PNAS paper. And the only thing they find is that the offenses are less productive. And they do find very little effect on defenses, but the effects that they do find are coming from eastward traveling. And they can trace all they find back to having a very strong shift or very strong effect on very specific statistics here, and that is home runs allowed. So just a quick look at the MLB, and whenever I'm too quick here, please interrupt me at any point of time, but I don't want to bore the US audience here. So the MLB is a very old and very traditional sports league. It is comprised of 2 different leagues, basically, the American and the National League. And this helps our identification strategy because these teams are all dispersed basically over the whole country. So you know the story. I mean, as in any major US sport, salaries, revenues, attendances are quite significant in terms of their economic impact. I mean, the MLB is kind of struggling a bit in certain markets to keep attendance up, but that's certainly a different story and should not affect what we are looking at here. So each team in the MLB basically plays around 160 games. Can be slightly more, can be slightly less, depending on what's going on during the seasons. Obviously, there was the pandemic season in 2022, so that was affected. There can be games that are rained out. There can be games that do end up in a tie that basically have to be played again. So there can be certain specifics that do change the number of games. But as I would argue, 160 games is quite a lot of workload that you have to incur during the months of March until early October when the playoffs kick in. And the nice thing about baseball is that these teams travel a lot. So we see many, many games in our sample where they are played on consecutive days. And when you do some research how these teams actually handle their traveling, there is clear evidence that there is overnight traveling in any cases. And that's the only way to tackle this, because if a game starts at 7 in the evening, then you have to travel overnight. I mean, there's no way to be at the opposing team's ballpark. So they do travel overnight. Immediately after finishing one game, they leave the ballpark and travel to the next venue or next city where the next game is going to happen. We have lots of key statistics there, more on the data in a minute, but the one we look at in detail is the errors. And I will explain in a minute what this is. Errors are basically a statistic that does show up in the box scores of MLB. So they are still kind of considered to be very important, although I would say that their correlation with the end result is not that strong to warrant showing them in the box score. But still, errors do show up and are easily identified in, probably all sorts of data that you can use. And in the end, an error should reflect a mistake that's being made by a fielder or pitcher. So to simplify, we would say by someone playing defense. And it is an error or a mistake that's made, although a professional player should be able to avoid this mistake and actually make a play. And by making a play, this means that an out should be generated. And generating an out in baseball means that you kind of fulfill part of the criteria in order to end the stint of offense of the opposing team, which is called the inning. We have, in the end, inning by inning data. And if you generate 3 outs in an inning, the right to play offense will change from one team to the other. And you basically avoid any scores in a certain inning. So there are a couple of examples. No need, probably no time to show these examples. You can look them up in the internet. If you have watched baseball, you know them pretty much for sure. So dropping fly balls or line drives that you should have caught for sure just by losing focus or concentration. If you fumble a ground ball, if you drop any balls, if you make bad throws, if you overthrow your considered target, then this should be counted as an error. And the nice thing is there are scorers in the MLB, so they make a judgment whether something is an error or not. So we have some experts really considering this. And in the end, it should more or less reflect whether a player lacks focus or concentration, and that does lead in an outcome that is certainly undesired and will not only prolong the inning, but also can ultimately lead directly or indirectly to scores for the opposing team. So where does the data come from? We take play-by-play or actually event-by-event from data from event logs downloaded from RetroSheet. So these are large event logs in, somewhat bad format, but they are sufficiently good to get everything out there we want. So we end up with about 100,000 individual regular season games from 1983 to 2024. We have from these reports information on weather, attendance, field condition, timing of the game, and so on. But this information is not complete. So it can be that like for around 60% we have weather data, for around 60% we have attendance, field condition is a little bit worse, and the timing of the game can be somewhat misleading because it's in a difficult format and not very usable, but more on that in the heterogeneity part of the analysis. So we will reduce this overall or complete sample of games to those games that are subject to overnight traveling, which means that we have treated games where we observe a game after having a game the day before, and where the ballpark the game T is played is different than the ballpark T-1. So the shortest travel basically could be the travel within Chicago, for example, when you go from the Wrigley Field to the White Sox ballpark. But we also have long travels. For example, if you go from Seattle to Miami, this is probably one of the games with the maximum distances. We consider a control group of games, and this control group of games should be games that are not affected by traveling at all. So these are games where no traveling is involved and where at least a break of 1 day is in between. So we end up with 264,000 innings with a maximum of 25 innings per game. So this is the reduced sample we are going to work with. And an inning is comprised of a minimum of 3 at-bats. So it can be way longer with potentially infinite numbers of at-bats because scoring never ends as long as you are productive as an offense. And we are able to identify which players are involved, either on offense or on defense. We have biographical information on player, including when they were born, when they first appeared in the majors, and the location of their birth. It's a bit messy, but for most of them we have it. We have geographical data on ballparks and the closest airports to these ballparks, where we can calculate the travel distances from, and we can clearly identify in which time zones in the US these ballparks are located. So in the end, we have over 6,000 team game observation where these teams traveled eastwards, just over 8,000 observations where they travel westwards, and the control group is comprised of a similar number of games where no traveling was involved. So let's look at the experiment a bit here. So we have 4 time zones in the US. Some specifics here, like this area here, the area here, or the area here, but that doesn't affect our outcome at all because in these areas no teams are located. So when we look at where these ballparks in our data are located, we see that 2 of them are actually in Canada. So that was Montreal, the Olympic Stadium in Montreal. The other one is in Toronto. The Toronto franchise is still in existence. The Montreal franchise was discontinued. So we have some evolvement over time. So it wasn't always the 30 teams in our data set as we have it now in 2024. But that changed as new franchises entered the major leagues. But you see in all these red dots that we have dispersion all over the US, with the only exception that in the mountain time zones, there's only one franchise, which is the Colorado Rockies located in Denver. So these are the ballparks where we take our geographical variation from. And the blue dots that appear now in this slide are the closest airports that are available to these teams traveling after they played a game in these ballparks in red. So when you see this, there's an abundance of airports in the US, and no team will have the difficulty to have a very long bus or even train ride to get to an airport. So that is not a potential issue. They can get to a close airport, take a flight probably just a few hours after the last pitch was thrown in the ballpark. And after then, traveling should be smoothly overnight, going to the next destination, which is one of these red dots, or rather the blue dots, if you fly there. So our experiment that we are exploiting looks like this. When you travel here from Arlington, Texas, where the Texas Rangers franchise is located, you can have a travel of this distance up north to the Minnesota Twins, which resembles a travel that is similar here eastwards, where you cross the time zone from Central Time to Eastern Time. So you lose 1 additional hour automatically here at the border when you travel to Cincinnati. The travel distance is the same. Everything else should be the same as well. So you travel probably from the same airport. And in case there is no striking unobserved difference in the travel here, we should see the only difference being that you cross this time zone here, which makes it automatically the fact that you lose 1 hour of time, and you lose 1 hour of time that you should actually, as a professional athlete, dedicate to regeneration, and that probably means sleep. The other direction would be westwards. So if you go now to Denver, Colorado, this means you cross 1 time zone westwards. This would mean that you get 1 additional hour, and you could spend this 1 additional hour on sleep. So this would give you more time, so to speak. So if you look just descriptively of what's going on here, we see the change in potential hours of sleep. 0 here if you travel within time zone, minus if you travel eastwards, and plus if you travel westwards. We see some of a variation that's hinting where we are going to in terms of the average number of errors by inning. But you see that nothing is significantly different from each other here. So it's just an indication where we are going to, but no conclusive evidence yet. So here's a matrix of potential sleep loss that you would encounter. So you see here at the diagonal, you would see you could either lose 3 hours or gain 3 hours, and that translates in these means. And it's also quite reassuring that if we go rightwards here, that the means do increase, but this is just reflecting in different numbers what we saw in the graph 2 slides ago. So we think it's going in the direction, and we have to dig deeper and estimate some sort of model actually disentangling what's going on in terms of traveling and what's going on in terms of losing time or gaining time if you want to go east or westwards. So this is the dispersion of travel distances. We see here in this grayish color that travel distances without crossing time zones do go up to about 1,500 miles. So we see that this is obviously kept at some point, because if you want to travel further, you have to cross time zones. You can't avoid that. And if we look at westward and eastward traveling, we see that there is nothing that would concern us too much in terms of where these distances are. The only difference is that they go further up as those that do not cross any time zone borders. So to get behind what is going on here, we want to estimate a rather simple fixed effect model that is explaining any measure of how many errors, or if any errors, did actually occur in an inning by whether the team did actually travel, so was treated by traveling, as compared to the control group where no traveling was involved during these games or between these games. And we could either travel westwards or eastwards. So these are dummies identifying whether we go eastwards or westwards. And we control for some characteristics of these games that should affect the outcomes of errors and other outcomes as well, like if it's a home game, where you are coming from in terms of whether the previous game was a day game or night game. Very few control variables actually, because the most important thing are our binary control variables, our dummies we include, because we include team season fixed effects and opponent season effects. We control for months fixed effects and inning fixed effects, because all these should affect how high the propensity is actually to make mistakes. We cluster the standard errors on team game level, because they should not be independently distributed within these team game observations. And we also estimate the specification including ballpark fixed effects, because ballparks do matter a lot, how difficult it is to play there. So that can have an effect, but we don't want that to have as our main specification, because controlling for the ballpark actually will take some of the effect away. Because if you control for a ballpark in Seattle, the only way to get to Seattle is travel westwards. I mean, you cannot travel eastwards to Seattle. Otherwise, you have to fly around the world. That doesn't make sense. So the treatment group are the games that are played on consecutive days, but in different ballparks. We can have 3 different treatments. The treatment that is the baseline treatment is whether these streams travel or not. And then we have this additional effect coming from either traveling westwards or eastwards. The control groups are those games where no traveling effects should be present. And that's also what the medical literature tells us, that if you only cross a maximum of 1 time zone after 1 day plus, you should not experience these effects anymore, or not at least that strongly that you should see it in the data. So here are our main results already. So if we look at these outcomes here, this is a plain model without any fixed effects and without any controls. And we already see that we don't estimate any travel effect. So this beta coefficient is pretty close to 0 and not significant. We estimate a positive effect on the propensity to make any errors in a certain inning here if you travel westwards. And we do not measure a significant effect of traveling westwards. If we then add control variables, we see that the effect is more precisely estimated, but in terms of the quantity stays in the same ballpark. It's just now significant at the 1% level if we include all these binary and non-binary control variables. Including ballpark fixed effects doesn't change too much. Precision goes down a little bit because now the experiment only relies on those ballparks that we can access from the same time zone, from the west and from the east. And then we also include travel distance quarter dummies, identifying 4 parts of the travel distance distribution, with also having the baseline where you do not travel, where the distance is basically 0. And we see if we now exploit within these travel distance quarter variation of traveling east or westwards, the effect is also there and quite similar to our baseline effect. If we then use travel distances linearly in our model, traveling within time zone, traveling eastwards and traveling westwards, we can actually estimate the marginal effect of 1,000 additional miles. So this is in 1,000 miles traveling. And we see the effect is still positive here. So we have a positive marginal effect of traveling eastwards on the propensity to make these mental mistakes. So mental performance does decrease. And it's quite substantial if you look at this coefficient here, which is 0.005, which would mean that traveling 1,000 miles more to the east increases the propensity to see at least one error in an inning by 0.5 percentage points. And if you look at the sample mean here, that's quite a substantial effect. Column 6 of this table already gives us a first robustness check, because here now we consider only the second games of a series after traveling. So these are basically the games happening on T+1. 2 these games we are using here in the main estimation sample. So this is a kind of very good robustness check that what is going on is not related to where you travel to, what franchise you face, what conditions there are, whatever you could consider, but should just be a game where the time zone crossing should not affect anymore. And we see that there is no significant effect here for any of these directions. What I missed to tell you is that here in this sample, we only use games where you cross either no time zone or one time zone. So we are reducing this to just crossing one time zone, losing 1 hour of sleep, or gaining 1 hour of sleep, so that the interpretation is very easy and nice. Splitting it up is a little bit difficult because people at the MLB actually take time to think over if a schedule makes sense or not. So they want to avoid these often long travel distances, meaning that the sample of games where you cross 2 or more, a maximum of 3 time zones, are quite rare in our data. So we wouldn't have enough power to gain additional insights here. But we see some indication on the next slides. So here is a slide presenting some robustness checks, because now we use the full sample as well. And this is just the coefficient beta of our model, indicating what is actually the effect from traveling itself. So we see, first of all, that for all these different samples, there is a positive travel coefficient, but it's never significant. It's very small. So we don't find any significant evidence for travel fatigue to be the case here. So this is our baseline or preferred sample, which is just the estimate I showed you before. These are short travels, because now we reduce it to only these travels up to 1,500 miles, where our first travel sample within time zones basically ends. Then we consider only small temperature differences of ±10 degrees Fahrenheit, because you could think of an effect coming from traveling eastwards, and you start your travel in September in nice Los Angeles, you end up in Boston where the weather is really bad, And you always make more mistakes, not because you lose sleep, but because you always encounter this deterioration in weather. The same approach here, we only consider fair weather games, which means that we look at domed games, we look at games where there is no precipitation, where the field is not wet, where there is no wind, etc. And we also consider games with a small latitude difference, which means that you could see an effect just by traveling very far north-south or the other way around, because the climate is completely different, the culture is completely different. So if we reduce this to small latitude changes of +10, -10, then we still see the same estimates here. Now let's look at the additional effects coming from where you travel in terms of east or west. And if we look at westward traveling, also no effect and quite close to zero, insignificant. But now if we bring eastward traveling into play, we see this very consistent and robust effect of an increase in the propensity to make these errors, these mental mistakes, if you travel eastwards. And we interpret this as evidence in favor of this effect of sleep loss instead of any travel fatigue or westward traveling effect that could hit these players. If we want to further investigate where this effect is coming from, we first thought of age as a potential player here. And if you consider what psychologists do in their experiments, for example, then they look at how sleep deprivation hits older and younger people differently. And what the results of these experiments are not really conclusive. So some do find actually that older people are hit more, some find that younger people are hit more, but it kind of tends to go in the direction that younger people should be affected more, although the baseline performance is probably higher in many tasks. So this is the age distribution calculated from looking at which players do actually make these errors, so we can identify them. We look at the day of birth, and from comparing this birth year to the year of the game, we simply calculate their age. So the age starts at 90, ends up crazily at 50. So I looked that up, that's not a mistake. So there is actually a player who played up to 50. But this is the distribution that we split up in 3 parts, the younger ones, the medium, and the older ones. And if we do this and estimate our model for these 3 different samples, we see the travel fatigue effect, nothing there. We see the westward effect, again, pretty close to zero, not significant. But then the eastward effect does the trick here. And we see that it is only significant and of a similar size to what we saw in the baseline effect, although that the effect evaluated on the sample mean is even higher here for the younger players that are at the age of 27 or younger. So there is no effect for medium age, and there is no effect for old age players. And the effect is quite substantial. If you look at the semi-elasticity, the probability of an error is increasing by more than 10%. That's quite a substantial effect, hitting these younger players. So if you look at the potential cutoff point, because splitting it in 3 samples might be arbitrary, you see if you define the dependent variable as errors being made by 19 years old, larger than 19 years old, larger than 20, 21, and so on and so forth, you see that the positive effect stays there up until, I would say 27, 28, but then it disappears and is pretty much zero from that on. The distribution is not that large anymore, so you have to stop at 33 to still have enough power to identify these mistakes, these errors, sorry. But yeah, it's kind of clear that at still very young age for baseball, the effect kind of stops and only the younger ones are affected. So can we actually disentangle this from experience? So can you get used to this Is it something that you kind of get accustomed to over time? Or is it more a biological thing that the younger you are, the more you are susceptible to this effect? And the literature that tries to identify this is quite inconclusive. So they kind of look at how more or less tenured CEOs of financial companies or managers of financial companies do behave if they have to make decisions under sleep loss. And what they typically find is that it is those that are more senior that are able to avoid these effects. But seniority in any type of business or company is not necessarily one by one correlated with age. So you can be very young and still be a senior manager at the company, but you can also be very old and not being a member of the top management there. So if you look at these papers, they argue that experience plays a role, but they cannot really go and disentangle age from experience effects. So we look at the density of the experience of these players by getting the information of when they first appeared in the majors. And you see it's going up quite a bit into the 20-ish years for some very specific players here. So baseball is obviously a sport that you can play for quite some time, which we think also helps us in terms of investigating more these mental aspects of performance here. And if we now make an attempt to disentangle this, we find our baseline estimates here. And the next estimates leave away errors being recorded by young players. And all of a sudden, our baseline estimate positive effect from eastward traveling disappears. If we leave out those that are short tenured, our effect jumps up back again to the baseline estimate. So it seems to be the case that age does matter, but if you are only short in the majors, and it could be that you enter the majors only at age being 35, but you are a rookie or a first year, second year player, but you are not affected anymore if you are not young. And if we now look at the other ends of the distribution, leaving away these errors committed by old players or by those that are long tenured doesn't do anything to our estimates. So we think this is quite convincing evidence that it is really this biological factor age doing the trick, and it's not about being accustomed to traveling or not that helps keeping performance where it should be in terms of these mental mistakes. So just a bit on game duration. So one could think, well, baseball is still a sport, so it's physically as well as mentally demanding. And it could be the case that if we had very long games in the previous game, then this could be just a physical exhaustion effect that we are picking up in our results. So if we now kind of shrink our outcome sample in the sense that we consider only longer and longer games here, our baseline positive eastward effect kind of still stays up there, gets more imprecisely estimated, the smaller our number of outcomes is here. But what's kind of surprising is if these games lasted very long, we actually come close to a similar negative effect on the propensity to make errors of westward traveling. So this is also kind of fitting our story in the sense that if you have a very long previous game t-1, traveling westwards will actually help you because you can recover using this at least one additional hour of sleep. Some more heterogeneity here, just briefly going through these results. If we split up the games into the first 5 innings and later innings to have kind of comparable power here, might look a bit arbitrary, but that gives us at least 2 comparable samples. Then we see that the effect is most prominent here in the first 5 innings. So it doesn't seem to be the case of it being a physical effect that drags along the longer the game is, that you get more tired, but you are simply jet lagged from the beginning on. And if anything, it gets kind of better during the game because you kind of refocus, you get into the game, and it takes some time to arrive mentally probably at what you are doing. If we split it up in short and long traveling, we already saw this marginal effect of travel distances. It, yeah, kind of no surprise appears in the long travels here. Also, if we consider where these players come from in terms of whether it's US-born players or international players, this can have an effect in the sense that if you are an international player, for example, coming from a Latin or Central American country, it could be the case that you are not used to travel within or between time zone rather. But if you are from the US, you're probably accustomed to that from an early age on, because if you play minor league baseball, if you play college baseball, little league baseball, you may encounter traveling across time zones already at a very young age. But still, we find these effects for both samples. I mean, if you look at the relative effects on the sample means, then this effect is even stronger here for the international players than for the US players. So it's kind of the same, doesn't make a difference, which supports the notion that you can never get used to it, basically. If we look at more or less traveling, then what we do here is simply sum up all the eastward traveling over a complete season and calculate the fracture of all games that or the relationship of the number of games after traveling eastwards to the total number of games. And then we split up the sample. And what happens is that the effect is present only for those games where the teams have or are more traveled, so to speak, which is an indication that what we pick up is actually an effect that kind of sums up over the year. The more you travel eastwards, the worse it gets, the more sleep you lose, the more jet lagged you are, and the more this effect will show up. And to end our results section and basically come to the conclusion, some completely new results, looking at team ability and win probabilities. So there was a discussion when I presented this for the first time where people said, well, there could be potential issue coming from selection bias, that it could be that in the Eastern time zone, the teams are just better because they are in better markets, they have a different tradition. So it could be traveling eastwards is always associated with playing better offenses. And if you play better offenses, they will score more, the innings will be longer, there will be more at-bats, there will be more hits, which will automatically result in more errors. So we downloaded ELO rating data for games between 83 and 21. And this is the distribution here of the win probabilities as implied by these ELO ratings for both teams. So they are kind of distributed from the beginning of 20% up to like 75% of a chance to win a game. So there are some strong favorites and underdogs in there, and we will exploit this. But some evidence just here whether it's actually the case that those in the Eastern time zones are the better teams in terms of the average ELO rating. And it is the case that the Eastern teams are up there in the first 2 decades of our data sample, but then they kind of fall off a bit, and there is nothing that would concern us too much in terms of spoiling the variation that we are exploiting. But still, if we look at some heterogeneity in terms of the win probabilities that are associated, if we look at those teams with a very low win probability, I mean, the estimate here of this East effect is positive, but far from being statistically significant. But if we now go to very even games, where it's more or less a 50-50 chance to win or not before the game, then we see this very strong and significant effect here. And the effect is still there if you are a strong favorite. So it seems to be the case when you are an underdog, this effect doesn't show up. Probably because you think you are the underdog anyways. Maybe your focus isn't in that game that much anyhow. and you are not susceptible to this additional loss in concentration or focus due to traveling eastwards and losing sleep. So some robustness checks, I go through that briefly and not show you or bore you with more results. So we defined alternative control groups. We also used the whole sample, pretty much doesn't change anything in terms of our baseline result. We also looked at error count instead of the binary dependent variable. I mean, errors go up to, I think, a maximum of 8, but that's very rare per inning. But it can, in principle, be the case to observe more errors. But if you look at the mean of the binary variable and the error count, they are pretty close together. So should not make a difference and doesn't make a difference. We also drop particular teams and ballparks stepwise to see whether the effect is driven by certain ballparks or even certain team year combinations or teams in general. Doesn't make a difference. Our results hold up. And we only consider the two most eastern time zones, which would be the central time zone and the eastern time zone, to verify whether teams that are in very similar markets, in a very similar area, that probably used to travel there a lot, to actually show the same effects, and it is the case. So also that doesn't explain anything we find. So let's just conclude. We use this natural experiment and we think we find robust evidence of positive effect of sleep loss on making more mental mistakes. So the mental performance decreases. This effect is very strong and pronounced for these professional athletes being aged 19 to 28. The older they are, the less affected they seem to be. Experience seems to play no role at all. So you cannot get accustomed to this effect. It seems to be something that's hitting you in terms of your age biology, but not really whether you are used to traveling, whether you are in this business for a long time. That doesn't seem to play a role. We find very weak evidence of a general travel fatigue effect, which is surprising, but there is nothing there. It is at least positive, so it's not going in the direction that we couldn't explain at all, but it's far from being statistically significant. Yeah, just some heterogeneity here. So in the end, we think that our effects are robust. We think that we are the first ones to really convincingly disentangle age and experience, and the effect heterogeneity tells an interesting story what is going on here. So I will leave you with the king himself, who actually always stresses that one of the most important things for him to keep up his performance at his relatively high age now, one important factor is to get enough sleep, and some of the sleep they get on planes. But while the NBA is also a very frequent traveling league, it's not as as stressful probably as in the MLB. So a different story there. That's it from my side. Thank you very much. And I'm already looking forward to your comments and questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mario. I am going to give you a team's round of applause. That was a very interesting talk on the effect of travel on performance. Thank you very much for that. We have plenty of time for questions and comments from the audience. So if you want to ask Mario a question, please do raise your hand. Stefan's got his hand up.
Hi, Mario. That was really interesting. I enjoyed that a lot, and it looks like a great paper. I think, judging from the attendance list, that there aren't a lot of baseball people here today, which is a bit of a shame, because there's quite a lot of things that one might think about that the baseball stuff might play in. So one thing I wanted to ask was whether you considered looking at the status of the players in terms of free agency. So in baseball, you're a rookie for your first 2 years, then you become arbitration eligible for 3 years, and then you become a free agent. So they have distinct stages in career progression, and I wondered if those might affect what was going on. Another thing I was wondering was about whether you could look at this in terms. I mean, clearly, one issue is which you sort of got at in some of your versions is the extent to which the context matters. And one thing you could do if you really wanted to dig down deeper is to go down to the event level and ask whether you could look at, say, for example, what the run expectancy was for each event where an error occurred, and see whether the run value was affected by the run expectancy and so on. So clearly an error when bases are loaded with 2 outs is absolutely disastrous, whereas an error with 2 outs and no one on base is not really that important. So that might be something you would look at. The other and the sort of third thing I was thinking was my colleague Richard Poulsen, who's at University of Michigan, he has a paper which I'm sort of vaguely remembering. I can't remember the exact details, but basically he has a slightly different story, or a story that might be correlated with yours, which is a party town effect. So here in his paper, he argues that players perform worse when they go to party towns. Yeah. And if you think about what the party towns are in the US, they're pretty much all going to be on the East Coast. Now, you could take LA as a party town, so that's obviously West Coast, but there aren't that many. There are relatively fewer games in LA, so it might work. So one thing you might want to do is at least to rule out the party town effect as an explanation.
Yeah, thanks. Great comments. I mean, for the first one, that's a great suggestion. I mean, the only thing we did is like use this distribution of the experience, and kind of look if that is driving anything. But we have not looked into the specifics of this career development. But that's a very interesting suggestion. I mean, the party town, that's a great thing. Obviously, I mean, dropping Miami probably from the sample would do a lot. Probably dropping Florida should do a lot. I don't think it would change too much, but yeah, I mean, we have to consider that. I mean, that's obviously an important thing.
I think he's published his paper, right? So
I have to look that up immediately. Yeah, I mean, that sounds very interesting just from itself, but that's very relevant. And the other thing, it's absolutely great suggestion to look into that on the event level. I mean, the data is huge. It's just blowing up into your face if you do too much, really. But when the errors happen are truly very, very important, I guess. I mean, we once had a discussion talking about the effects, ultimately how it would affect the outcome of a game. And if you regress like the number of errors on the game outcomes, whether it's dependent win the game variable or whether it's just the run margin, whatever, it's always positively associated with success on the game level. I mean, that's kind of obvious, but it's the same story all the time. If you look at individual decisions or individual performance and you want to link it with some sort of game outcome, that's always tricky because you need some sort of IV. And the variable is too weak of an IV to get the first stage here. But I mean, there's clear evidence that there's association between these errors and winning actually is as it should be. Whether the reduced form just doesn't work. So if you regress this traveling on the game outcome, there is too much going on to explain what the outcome of a game is.
One thing you might do, I did some work with a PhD student, Ryan Pinheiro, and we wrote a couple of papers using run values, and so he's very good at that and has it all set up. So you might want to talk to him. Maybe there's another paper, a follow-up paper you might write with him, and that he might be interested in.
That's great. Yeah.
I could put you in touch with him. But
thanks. Great comments.
Great. I love the paper. Really good.
Thank you, Stefan. And more questions and comments from the audience? especially those who've got good baseball knowledge, as Stefan points out. I mean, the only thought I had as someone who doesn't have much baseball knowledge was about the scheduling effect, which obviously you kind of, I guess, you got out with a little bit towards the end there. And I don't know how long, I don't know how many consecutive days they make these teams play for. Is it usually just 2 back to back, or do they do 3 or more back to back, that kind of thing?
That's a good question. I'm pretty blank in terms of some descriptives on that, but I think it happens that they play 3 games in a row. But I wouldn't be sure on what's the maximum there. Yeah. But I mean, the thing is, like, there is, by definition, when you arrive at the destination, there are at least 2 games there. I mean, that's the common thing there. And that's why we have this nice kind of placebo treatment if you look at the second game. And if it's really something like the party town effect or some specific travel thing, then it should be there as well. If it's just the hour you lose, I mean, nobody cares losing an hour 2 days afterwards. I mean, that's kind of, you're not going to Japan, right? You're just.
Pete.
Just to let Stefan know, there is another baseball person here. Actually, I think you've pretty much done everything I thought about. The only thing, I guess that you've already done tons, but you might want to consider this. Late season versus early season, because there's so many games played. I wonder if sleep matters more late season when you're already kind of fatigued.
Yes, that's absolutely one thing. We looked into that a bit. I mean, there are 2 issues. It's somewhat correlated with the stuff I showed you earlier on if that kind of amounts to a certain effect over time. So it's difficult to disentangle late season and whether you travel to eastwards often or not. So that's the one thing. And the other thing is, if you like compare late season to early season, I mean, it's certainly different if you travel from Los Angeles to Boston in September or if you do that in early June, I would guess, because I mean, in warm weather in Los Angeles, you play well, you are accustomed to it, then you go there, you hit the autumn weather, and it will have a different effect as if you travel earlier. But yeah, would be nice to find a good way to kind of disentangle the seasonality and this amounting of effects. And yeah.
Like I said, I'm sure you've done enough. It's really well done papers, but I was just giving you
but
something to think. Yes, think about down the road.
Yeah. Great, thanks.
Thanks, Pete.
Yep.
Any more questions and comments? You obviously can't get at this, Mario, but there must be an effect whereby if you've got small kids at home, you know, you go away, you may know this yourself, you go away on conference and you get a better night's sleep because you're away from the effect of that. So there must be some situations where you get a better night's sleep because you're on the road and you're away from a difficult or more tricky sleep situation at home, perhaps. But obviously you can't get at that with the data you've got, I'm sure.
Yeah. The first conference I went to after having my first kid, I almost overslept my own presentation. So.
Fantastic. Well, as there are no more questions, we'll wrap up. I'll say thank you, Mario. Again, that was a really, really interesting talk, a very well done paper. Lots of robustness checks, really interesting effect as well. We will not be meeting next week. And as yet, we have an open slot for the following week, June the 6th. So if you do want to present in 2 weeks' time, please do let me know. But otherwise, we've got a week off next week and we've got a weekend ahead. So I wish you all a fantastic weekend and I look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye.
Cheers, Mario.
Bye.